All right, it's working.
Okay, cool. Here we go. Fluid and electrolytes. So when you hear the word fluid, we're essentially talking about body fluid, obviously, right? And so body fluid is all over us. Like, we are made up of primarily fluid, and basically it's like the liquid part of your cells. There's a liquid part of your cells, there's a liquid part of your tissue. Your blood has plasma, and that's the liquid portion of that tissue. Your blood also has blood cells in it, immune cells, but it's primarily made up of plasma, which is the liquid portion. Cerebral spinal fluid, the fluid that flows through your brain and your spinal cord, that is another type of body fluid. Synovial joints, like your knee joint, your shoulder, your hip, all of these joints have these capsules around them, and there's fluid inside of those capsules. There's synovial fluid. We've been talking a lot about digestion and all the fluids that are part of digestion of certain nutrients. Digestive juices are also considered a body fluid. So think about body fluid as being everywhere, and anything that is liquid inside of your tissue, cells, and structures is that body fluid. So how much should we have? So a healthy 20 to 40-year-old, everyone in this room is in that category, is going to be approximately like 60 to 65% fluid. Older adults, however, will have less body fluid. They're going to be a lower percentage, lower proportion. And then children are going to have a greater proportion. And we'll talk a little bit more about why in just a bit. Also, your fluid, this body fluid, this liquid that we're talking about, is water primarily. And we'll dig into that in a bit. And then also solutes. One of the solutes that we'll cover today, obviously, is electrolytes. And so we'll talk about a bunch of those minerals. There are other solutes as well in your body fluid, especially like in your digestive system. You've got a lot of enzymes. You've got mucus in certain areas. So those are other solutes that are inside of your fluid. But it's primarily water. And then we'll also talk about electrolytes today. So also, this fluid is contained in compartments. And so the inside of our body has compartments, kind of like a suitcase with a bunch of compartments in it. Our body is the suitcase, and we've got all these compartments within it. And so let's talk about where these compartments are and how much fluid is stored in each one of those compartments. So first of all, 2/3 out of all the fluid in your body is stored inside of your cells. So it would be considered intracellular. So out of all that body fluid, 2/3 of it, 66%, is going to be inside your cells. And then the remaining 1/3, or 33%, will be outside of the cell, or called extracellular. Now this has a couple of kind of sub-compartments within it. Intravascular would be your blood, all of the fluid that's inside of your blood vessels, as well as your lymphatic system. So that would be intravascular, kind of a sub-compartment that's considered extracellular. Does that make sense? And then also, another term you might see is interstitial. So an interstitial compartment is, if you had an organ that had a bunch of tissue in it, there's going to be fluid that's flowing, that's inside that tissue, but not inside the cells. Got it? So it's within, interstitial means within the tissue, but it's still going to be considered extracellular, so it's not inside the cell. Okay? That's interstitial. So let's talk a little bit more about this interstitial, or this tissue fluid compartment. And let's talk primarily about muscle and adipose tissue. And so here's where we're going to get differences in how much water is going to be held within each person's body. So muscle tissue holds significantly more water than adipose tissue. So a lot more water than adipose tissue. Can you not see from that there?
No, I can't. It's just hard with like the glare and the orange.
Oh, we can, let's shut the blinds that way. Now I need some like different, like dark colors. My blue and red is dying, and black. Alright, is that helpful? Better? Okay. Okay, so back to that. So muscle tissue has way more water than adipose tissue. So let's talk about that. So we were talking about how older adults have less water, body fluid in their body. This is going to be one of those reasons. So as we age, our body composition changes to be less muscle and more adipose tissue. So older adults will tend to have less of that muscle tissue compartment. Children are primarily more lean muscle mass rather than adipose mass. And so they're going to have more body fluid in that tissue than, say, somebody that's in their 30s. And then obviously than older adults. So it all kind of depends on this body composition. So age is going to determine, it's going to individualize how much of that water is stored in muscle. Also sex. Men tend to have more muscle tissue than adipose tissue, and females tend to have more adipose tissue than the males have. And so again, it boils down to body composition. So females will have less body fluid than males will because of that decrease in muscle mass. However, training status does play a part in that. So athletes that are very lean and have more muscle mass are going to have more body fluid. So let's talk about this as well. So glycogen, right? We talked about the storage form of carbohydrates is glycogen. We also talked about how glycogen stores can be trained to store more, and that's one of the training adaptations. So 1 gram, I'll put this right here. So 1 gram of glycogen will store 0.1 to 0.15 ounces of water. So if you have more glycogen stores, if you have more glycogen stored in your muscle tissue, then you're going to be storing more water. So do you guys remember, or you can look back in your notes, the range for an untrained individual and how much muscle glycogen stores they have? How many grams? Look back in your notes, see if you can find it.
Is that untrained or trained?
Untrained.
It's 120 for untrained.
120 grams?
Yeah. And trained was 1,500.
Yeah, I think it's more like 3. I think the untrained is more like 350 to 500. Is that 120 maybe?
It just says in skeletal muscle.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let's do this. Let's say the number I have is 350 to 500. We'll have to look that up and see where that 120 came from. So
Yeah, I remember you saying 120 as well.
120? Okay, let's do this. Let's do 120 to 350. How about that? It varies, obviously. And then a trained individual, what was that range for a trained individual?
This is 1,500.
1,500? Got it. Okay. So, do the math, Like say this individual has 350 grams of glycogen, multiply that by 0.1, it's gonna be about 4.5 pounds of water, okay? So this person is gonna be somewhere approximately 4.5 to 5 pounds of water stored just with that glycogen. Now a trained individual that has, say, a glycogen store capacity of 1,500 grams of glycogen, it's gonna be somewhere around like 18, 19 pounds just devoted to water. So it's a lot different in how much body fluid is stored depending on this training status. So these are general, right? General percentages, however, it will be very individual based on age, body composition, gender, sex, as well as training status, which kind of all boils down to that interstitial compartment. What tissue is actually making up most of your body composition. All right. So now let's talk about water and our primary solute electrolytes. So starting with water, we all know this is critical for life, right? It's a big deal. We need it. We have a lot of it in our body. But let's talk about the characteristics. So water is the largest contribution to our body fluid. And a good example is that blood plasma. Now, if our blood plasma has adequate or a high amount of water within it, it's going to increase the blood volume within our blood vessels. What do you think that might do to save blood pressure?
Raise it.
Raises blood pressure, yeah. So increased water in our blood plasma increases the blood volume, therefore increases blood pressure. Vice versa. So a decrease in blood volume would be, or a decrease in the water within our blood plasma would decrease blood pressure. So let's do this. So an increase in blood volume leads to an increase in blood pressure. Oops. We put blood BP. So this is going to come into play in just a bit. I want you to remember this. The decrease in blood volume leads to a decrease in BP. Okay. So another very important characteristic of water is that it is a solvent. And so things dissolve in water, like electrolytes and other solutes. So things dissolve in water. So our minerals. Oh my gosh, what am I spelling? Minerals, nutrients, vitamins. This is how this stuff gets transported around. We got, medications that dissolve in water. Without water, these things wouldn't have a substance to dissolve in, and therefore couldn't be transported throughout the body. It's a lubricant. This is a big deal. Where do you think in the body that water acts as a lubricant? Joints, right? So synovial fluid in our synovial joints. Good. What else?
Digestion.
Digestion, good. So digestive motility. That stuff's got to make its way through our intestines. Without water, without this lubricant, we get constipated, right? Doesn't help. What else? Who has a runny nose? Who has watery eyes? Who has spit? All of these organs, right, in our face and our orifices that open up to the body or outside the body are lubricated by body fluid, primarily water. So we've got our eyes, our nose, mouth. So another big one is the pleural cavity that surrounds each lung. So our lungs move quite a bit, and so they need to have a frictionless surface to move around within. And that's where we get this tissue that surrounds the lungs called the pleural cavity, and there's fluid and water that's kind of lining around that lubricates the lungs. This is what allows it to move around. I think it's this. I don't think that's right. No. Thank you. Need you guys for this. The T. Okay. Also, we've got cerebral spinal fluid. So our brain, again, is cushioned by a tissue capsule that has CSF in it. And all of that lubricates those organs. We need to be able to move around within our body, not have friction, and not bump up against structures and be injured or damaged. So the last characteristic of water that's super important is it changes temperature slowly. So because our body has so much water in it, and this characteristic of changing temperature slowly, it allows us to be able to maintain our happy place in core temperature, whether we're in cold environments or hot environments. So if we didn't have this water to kind of absorb heat and dissipate heat easily so that it doesn't change temperature fast, our core temperature would fluctuate rapidly and drastically. And so all of our functions in our body, like homeostasis with core temperature. When we get too hot or too cold, things don't work right. And so this ability for us to keep this core temperature in that happy place, despite external temperatures, is basically due to the prevalence of water within our body. So this allows us to maintain core temp homeostasis. All right. Here we go. Let's move over now to electrolytes. We talked about water. We talked about the majority of the element that's in body fluid. But now let's talk about the solute electrolytes, because when we get to sodium, you'll realize that these electrolytes are responsible for making sure that water is moving into and out of these compartments to maintain balance. And that's what we're looking for all the time, is fluid balance. And we need these electrolytes to kind of drive that movement. So again, critical for life. So sodium, potassium, chloride, phosphorus, calcium, magnesium, those are all electrolytes. And so why are they called electrolytes? So when they are in food or in some sort of structure that we are consuming, when they reach our body, they will dissolve in the water, and it will actually disassociate into electrically charged ions, whether it being positive or negative. And so this positivity or this negative charge to the ion after it dissolves in water is what allows, when those ions move across, say, cell membranes into and out of cells, this is how we conduct electricity. So our neurons, big deal here. Who here, we just covered it up the other day. But the ability for our neurons to actually send an electrical impulse is absolutely due to sodium and potassium being able to be exchanged across the membrane. So this drives electrical impulses. So another thing that electrolytes do when they disassociate in water is then they become these ions that can combine with other atoms in our body to make certain substances that are important. Okay, so right here, HCO3, anybody know what this stands for?
Bicarb.
Bicarb, good. So bicarbonate is created in our pancreas as well as in our kidneys, and it is used to buffer acidity in our blood and in our tissues. So we need this so that we don't become too acidic. Again, the happy place of pH is very important to all the functions in our body. And so having, say, chloride, for instance, available to build this molecule inside of our body is very important. This is just a tiny example. There's a million other examples that these electrolytes do. But what's the biggie? One that we always think of, say when we sweat too much and we need electrolytes, that's usually how it's referenced, is sodium, right? Salt. So let's start there. So sodium, Na+. So this is, so we're going to talk about this for quite a bit here because sodium is the primary driver of water in and out of compartments or in and out of cells or in and out of tissues. So I want you to always remember this, that water always will follow sodium. So water, this marker's starting to suck now. Water always follows sodium. This is a big deal, okay? Who knows the term that is used to describe the change of water from one place to the next? Osmosis. Good. This is via osmosis. Let's talk about how this works. So imagine you've got a cell here, right? Okay? You've got the space inside the cell and you got the space outside the cell. In between those two spaces, you have the cell membrane or the plasma membrane. Okay? Water can easily dissolve or diffuse or via osmosis across that membrane. It doesn't need any facilitation, it doesn't need a transporter, it just passes in and out of that membrane. However, solutes such as sodium, as well as potassium, they don't. They're not, the membrane is not permeable to those ions. So what happens here is if we have, say, inside the cell, a couple of sodiums but a lot of water, and then outside the cell we have a lot of sodium and a little bit of water, this water is going to want to equalize that concentration of the solutes, okay? So if we've got more solutes on this side than this side, where's the water going to want to go? You got it. Good. So this is going to drive, this concentration of sodium out here is higher than it is inside the cell. This is going to cause water to want to go that direction. So then we get osmosis happening. Water goes towards the sodium. So have you ever heard of the term tonicity? So it's a term that refers to the ability for a solute to essentially influence the movement of water through compartments. And so a solution or some area can be hypertonic, hypotonic, isotonic, and it's basically talking about the concentration of solutes that are in it. So if we were going to use this term isotonic, what that would look like in this example would be, it would be equal. So let me draw that. Let's do this. Okay. This is isotonic right here. We've got the same amount of sodium and water in both of these compartments, all right? gonna be equalized. We found some balance here. However, in the case of a hypertonic solution, say that we had more sodium out here, this out here would be considered hypertonic because there's more solutes on this side than this side. So this would be considered hypertonic, and then this side would be considered hypotonic. Does that make sense? And so which direction will water go? Will it go from a hypotonic to a hypertonic area, or vice versa? Yes. So if this is the case right here, we've got hypertonic outside the cell and hypotonic inside the cell, water is going to move towards that hypertonic solution, okay? So let's define this. So hypertonic means is a solution that is high in solutes. This is going to attract water. Sodium in this case. Okay. So now, if this happens right here, and water leaves the cell and moves extracellularly, this is going to become deficient in water, and the cell will actually start to shrink and become dysfunctional. This is what happens when we get dehydrated or severely dehydrated. When those cells lose their water because we aren't either taking in enough or we're losing it at a more rapid rate than we take it in, that water is going to leave the cell towards the tissue because there's going to be more sodium outside the cell. Got it?
Mhm.
So if we were to flip this, and we were to have more sodium inside the cell than outside the cell, this now becomes hyper, and this is going to be hypo. So which direction is the water going to go now? Inside the cell, right. So H2O is going to move this way. So if this happens, then the cell will actually become overhydrated, get more water, and it will swell and again become dysfunctional. So we always are trying to achieve this isotonic balance between the compartments, the solution within each of the body compartments. And if it's not in balance, this water it'll gravitate towards the area that's going to have the highest concentration of solutes, whatever direction that is. So let's define hypotonic. So it would be a solution that is low in solutes, and therefore it loses water. So sodium, the presence of sodium within all of these body compartments that we talked about here is what is going to drive this movement of water from one compartment to the other. Okay, so this is why this is a very important mineral, an electrolyte. So let's talk about the kidneys, because the kidneys uses this exact function, all right? So your kidneys, the main job of your kidneys is to filter your blood and then excrete the waste out in your pee, okay? But it responds to a lot of the things that are going on within your body, such as blood pressure. And so remember that if we have a lot of water in our body, therefore it's going to end up in our blood plasma. We're going to have an increase in blood volume and an an increase in blood pressure. So our kidneys are gonna sense this. And so they sense, if they sense an increase, let me use a different color. If the kidneys sense an increase in blood pressure, they are going to then make sure the salt that's in the bloodstream ends up in our urine, because that's going to then drive water out of the bloodstream, and we will excrete it in urine, and therefore lower blood volume and lower blood pressure. You guys got that? So it uses this either absorption of salt or excretion of salt to drive the fluid levels in our body, and therefore increase our urine output or decrease our urine output. And it all is responding to this blood pressure. So when we drink a ton of water, we pee a lot, right? This is why. That water ends up in our blood, it increases our blood pressure, the kidneys will sense that, and it will say, okay, well, we don't need it, let's just pee it all out. And it uses sodium as that driver. So you're peeing out a lot of sodium and that fluid. So if it senses a high BP, it's then going to excrete sodium, therefore excrete water, because water always follows it. This is going to end up with an increase in our urine output. Vice versa. If we have low blood volume, low blood plasma volume, it means that we have not enough water in our body, and our blood pressure will decrease. Our kidneys are going to sense that, and they're going to say, okay, let's keep the salt in our bloodstream so that whatever water is ending up in the kidneys here will stay in the bloodstream to then increase the blood volume and bring blood pressure back to homeostasis. So it works in both ways, using salt, sodium, as this driver of that fluid. Got it? So if we have a drop in BP, we will have a drop in urine output. That makes sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, blood pressure medications. A lot of blood pressure medications affect or influence this exact system here. So, beta blockers, ACE inhibitors, diuretics, those are all very commonly prescribed blood pressure medications to help someone lower their blood pressure. And what it's doing in various places in this cycle is it's blocking the reabsorption of salt in water, and it's increasing urine output. So for instance, someone that is on a blood pressure medication that is trying to always dump sodium in water, do you think that they are at a higher risk for dehydration?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So they always need to be more conscious of their water and electrolyte intake when they're exercising or in hot, humid climates. So this is very much related to our blood pressures, and our kidneys use those salts to drive that fluid volume in our blood. So another place that sodium is used is the sodium-potassium pump. You guys heard of the sodium-potassium pump? We'll talk about it a bit more when we get to potassium. But yes, well actually I'll do that. I'll just save it for that. All right, where do we get our sodium? Most likely from salt, right? Table salt, right? And from our food. The typical American diet is high in processed foods, high in restaurant foods, and there is so much sodium in processed foods and restaurant foods that individuals in America tend to take in more sodium than they need. However, if this isn't your normal diet, then your sodium intake is probably going to be just fine. It's these these food sources that have this massive bolus of sodium that ends up affecting, or this is kind of why our dietary guidelines have a key recommendation about sodium intake. Who remembers what that is? What is the RDA for sodium? Yep. So the RDA says that 2,300 milligrams of sodium per day is good, and they don't want you to go over. So let's do this. Less than or equal to 2,300 milligrams per day. Now, there is another part of that key recommendation for people that have hypertension. Does anyone remember what that recommendation of sodium intake is? So it also says people with hypertension, so HTN stands for hypertension, meaning high blood pressure. The dietary guidelines recommend that they stay below 1,500 milligrams per day. So, here's an example. One slice of pepperoni pizza has 690 milligrams of sodium. Who eats just one slice of pizza? I don't. You know, it's not common to just eat one slice of pizza, and that's just one meal. Like, how much sodium comes just out of one slice of pizza is crazy. Deli turkey. So a 2-ounce amount of deli turkey for your sandwich is 500 milligrams of sodium. Like processed meats, like deli meats, are very high in sodium. However, if you were to just salt, say a salmon or your veggies or some sort of thing in your saute pan, it would be hard to put more than 100 milligrams of salt, because then your food would taste like crap. It would be like, your tongue would shrivel up and die. So if you're just salting your food and it isn't pre-salted, you're not going to have to worry about, finding this, staying under this 2,300. But it's like the hidden salt, kind of like the hidden sugars, that is a big driver in our sodium consumption in America. So, like, for instance, I'll put this like one dash or pinch of salt. So if you just took some and put it on there, is 155 milligrams compared to one slice of pizza being 690 milligrams. So you can see where Americans get their salt, right? See where it comes from. So what do you guys think? So salt is absolutely important to consume, especially say you exercise regularly and you sweat. Like, you're losing water and you're also losing salt when you sweat. And so for an individual that is, a regular exerciser and sweats every day, every other day, do you think this is enough?
No.
Probably not. That individual's going to need more. However, if someone is not excreting all of that salt through exercise and sweat, then maybe that's enough. So it's interesting though, what's your opinion? Do you think that the sodium recommendations, or a key recommendation about sodium, should be in our dietary guidelines?
Yes.
Yeah? Why do you think?
Because they're helpful for the general population.
Mm-hmm.
If you're an athlete, then just eat more.
Yeah.
of it.
Yeah, so it's something to always think about. These dietary guidelines they're for general population. It's not sports nutrition, it's not sports recommendations. And it's over 60% of Americans, I think over the age of 55, are on blood pressure medication. It's insane how many cases of hypertension there are in our nation. And so you can see why salt is like this limit on sodium or this limit on salt is part of our dietary recommendations. However, in my opinion, I think it's a little bit hard for people to actually calculate that. Like, what does 2,300 milligrams look like? You know, I don't know. You know, like, I can Google what things are, you know, but the nutrition labels are gonna have some on there, but if you eat at a restaurant, you know, it's really hard to find out how much sodium is in your food, or what nutrients at all are in your food. So it's still kind of just vague, it's hard to follow.
Is climate affects the salt you can take? Because I know I'm from Chad, it's really hot over there. Like you sweat without even extra salt.
Yeah.
So like, can I get, you know, higher sodium intake than here?
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, actually, that's a good question. Save that for just a few minutes, because I'm gonna talk about how the environment that we're in affects our fluid and electrolyte loss. That's very, very individual and situational. So, cool. All right. So let's breeze through these other electrolytes so that we can actually get to that conversation. We talked about sodium, the biggie. But now let's talk about potassium. So a lot of minerals as well as vitamins aren't gonna have very specific RDAs that come from research. They're gonna have the AI, or the adequate intake, in that calculation, okay? So potassium's in that boat. So the AI for potassium, let's try this one. The adequate intake for potassium is 4.7 grams per day. So potassium works with sodium in that sodium-potassium pump. And so this pump is present pretty much in every cell membrane. And what it's doing is it's pushing sodium and potassium into and out of the cell to then regulate fluid, and also to change, say, the electrical charge on either side of that membrane for, say, like a neuron. And so this structure, this transporter, this sodium-potassium pump, is always going to be sending 3 sodiums out and 2 potassiums in. It uses ATP to pump these ions on either side. And so we need potassium for this pump to have something to actually pump. And it's very, very important in maintaining the rhythm of your heartbeat. And so potassium levels, whether they are high, too high or too low, can cause arrhythmias. So this is a big influencer on your heart. So think of potassium as being where it manifests itself is going to be your heart rhythm. So too much or too little potassium causes arrhythmias. So where do we get potassium? Well, we get it from dark leafy greens. We get it from a lot of fruits. Bananas obviously are high in potassium. We get it from, let's see, what else do we get it from? I wrote it down here. Potatoes and beans also have a good bit of potassium. So, write that down. So dark greens, fruits, potatoes, legumes. Good sources of potassium. Americans don't typically, on average, eat enough potassium because, on average, we don't eat enough fruits and vegetables. It's just kind of the norm. All right, let's talk about chloride now. So when you see chloride, it's always going to be bound to a sodium as table salt in our food. That is where chloride comes from. And so chloride, its role once it hits the body it's going to contribute to the production of hydrochloric acid in our stomach. So we need it to produce this acid for digestion. Also, it's a component of that bicarbonate molecule that our pancreas and kidneys create to buffer pH. So now let's talk about phosphorus. So this is another biggie. So phosphorus, once it makes its way into its body, it converts to phosphate. So in the body, it's going to be in the form of phosphate. What big molecule in our body has phosphate in it? I think I heard it.
Bones.
DNA, bones, adenosine triphosphate, ATP. Yeah, so we need phosphate to phosphorylate AT or an ADP or an AMP into ATP. We need it combined with calcium. To give our bones its structure. We also need it for DNA and RNA. All those nucleic acids need phosphate. So again, a big important role of this. So where do we get phosphate in our food? We get it in beans, dairy products, meats, and then sometimes there will be fortified dairy products or fortified non-dairy products. So like soy milk, almond milk, coconut milk. A lot of those will be fortified with calcium, vitamin D, and then also phosphorus. I forgot to write down the AI for chloride. So chloride, let's back up just a bit. The AI, the adequate intake for chloride is 2.3 grams per day. And then phosphorus, this actually has an RDA, not an AI. And so it's going to have a different unit, 700 milligrams per day. So we just touched on those electrolytes, kind of the four biggies. Sodium being the one that is, I want you to mostly understand and how it drives water. So I'm going to erase this right here. Is that all right with everyone? Okay. Now let's talk about this movement of water within these body compartments. All the time, our body wants to achieve fluid and electrolyte balance. Bring on my markers now. Fluid balance is also known as euhydration, so EU hydration. Also electrolyte balance is what we're trying to achieve as well. So we can take in this stuff, right? We can drink fluids. When we eat vegetables and fruits that have fluid within them, we are getting water. All of these minerals and these electrolytes come from either table salt or the foods that we eat. We can take this stuff in, right? But how do we lose fluid? So we lose fluid by what?
Sweating,
Sweating, peeing, breathing. We lose fluid in feces as well. Even when we're not sweating, we are actually losing a little bit of water from our skin all the time. So we're always losing some, and we always have to take it in so that we can achieve this balance, right? So let me talk about how these compartments there's like a hierarchy in where the fluid goes in the compartments. So let's start with the situation of dehydration. So dehydration is not enough water, but we have electrolyte balance. Okay, so low fluid, solutes, fine. It's different than, well, I'll talk about that one as well. So oh my gosh, mini markers are all dying. Dehydration. So this is when we either don't take in enough fluid, like if we exercise, don't drink any water, we can become dehydrated, or things like vomiting and diarrhea will lose a lot of fluid here. So how this starts is, it's going to start by leaving our blood volume first. So in the case of, say, sweating, let's talk about that. So when we get hot, we vasodilate, and we will also, the vessels will move towards the surface of the body, and we start drawing water out of our blood volume to produce sweat. And that sweat excretes outside of our body and then evaporates, and we cool ourselves off. So the first instance is this water is going to leave the blood volume. So what's the result of this? Is we're going to end up with low fluid, but a high solute situation. What is this considered as far as tonicity? This would be hypertonic. Got it? So when we sweat, we lose the majority water. We will lose some salts, but we mostly lose water. So we're going to end up with more solutes than we have fluid in our blood. So the next stage is the tissue stage. So now this tissue compartment, this interstitial compartment, is then going to lose its fluid because of osmosis. This hypertonic situation over here is going to then suck all the water out of the tissues, okay? So then what do we end up with here?
Shrinks.
Shrinks.
Mm-hmm.
We also end up with decreased fluid increased solutes. Therefore, it's hypertonic. So the next and last stage on our hierarchy, the last place that we're going to lose the water because it wants to keep it there as long as possible, is going to be the cells. So now this ends up hypertonic, and then we end up losing water out of the cells. So fluid leaves cells, and this ends up being low fluid, high solute. And the result of a cell losing all of its fluid is it shrinks and dysfunctions. This is dehydration. So when does this happen? When we lose a lot of bodily fluid from vomiting, diarrhea, when we're sick, or if we exercise and we sweat or we're in a hot climate and we aren't taking in the amount of water that we need. So now let's talk about another situation that's called water intoxication. Or, anybody know the other term for this? Or overhydration? This also can be called hyponatremia. This hyponatremia, so natremia is referencing sodium. Hypo meaning not enough. So here we have plenty of fluid, but not enough sodium. So this happens when someone loses a lot of fluid and electrolytes from sweating, and then they take in copious amounts of water and no electrolytes. They almost like dilute themselves. Anyone ever suffered from hyponatremia before? It's bad news. Like, people end up in the hospital for this. So this is where we have copious fluid and electrolyte loss coupled with a high intake of only water. So this happens in the exact opposite way. I'm not going to write it all out. I'll just use another color. So we take in, say we drink too much water or drink a ton of water and no electrolytes. That blood volume is going to increase, and then it's going to end up resulting with increased fluid and decreased solutes. So then, where's that fluid going to go? To the tissues, right. So then we end up with this. And it has the same result of too much fluid, not enough solutes. And then the next stage in the hierarchy, we end up with this, having too much fluid and not enough solutes. And the result is the cell swells and dysfunctions. So I want you to also read in your book about heat illnesses and how they're related to these situations right here. I'm not going to cover it, especially because we only have 10 minutes and I have more to say. And I also want you to read a bit more about, there's other disorders that are related to other electrolyte imbalances, like potassium imbalance. You might have a calcemia imbalance in there as well. Okay, so let's now talk about the environment and how this is going to play a part in fluid loss. So you were talking about you grew up in Chad. What's the high temp there, or what's a normal temp? 100 something?
Yeah.
Is it dry heat?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, not humid heat. So let's talk about the environment. Right over here. So we can lose fluid, right? From exercise, sweating, unfortunate events of vomiting and diarrhea. But the environment, things that we can't actually control, can exacerbate that. So if it's hot, like in Chad, what'd you say it was? 100 what? Or is it Celsius?
Yeah.
40?
Sometimes
Sometimes higher than 40 Celsius? Oh my gosh. Okay, bloody hot, all right? And so this, oh my gosh. So this is gonna increase our sweat rate as well as increase our onset of sweating, meaning our core temperature that we have to get to sweat. So we're gonna increase all of this, we're gonna increase fluid loss, right? And so this is an instance where intake of fluid and electrolytes is gonna be absolutely important so that this person doesn't end up dehydrated, right? So let's talk about humid environments. So humid environments are like the hot humid, let's talk about that one. So this is going to be an increase in sweating as well. However, because of the humidity, the evaporation of the sweat is inhibited. And so the actual cooling effect of sweating is lessened. And so this situation is highly susceptible for heat illnesses, heat exhaustion, heat stroke. So cannot evaporate, heat illness susceptibility. So let's also talk about cold environments. So cold, dry air. So cold air is almost always dry. So here, the air, when it reaches our lungs, has to be moisturized before it gets there. And it also has to be warmed before it gets there. So if we are outdoors in the cold, dry air, whether we're doing exercise or not, our respiration is going to, or our loss of water during our respiration is going to increase. So, water loss is increased during respiration. So, when we are skiing all day at the resort, we're not really like skinning and doing any endurance activities, but we are breathing a lot in this cold, dry air. We are increasing our susceptibility to dehydration before, and we don't even really know it, because it's going to be so much more increased from just that like breathing in that cold, dry air all day long. Altitude. Let's talk about this one. So you get this, at altitude, typically you're gonna have this situation going on as well. So increase water loss during respiration. But what happens to our respiratory rate when we go to altitude? It increases as well. So we increase our respiratory rate. We increase the loss of water during respiration. Who else, or who knows what happens to your blood pressure when you go to altitude? It increases as well. So BP goes up at altitude until you are acclimated. This is all acute altitude exposure right here. What do our kidneys want to do when our BP goes up?
What is this? Pee.
Makes us pee more, right?
Yeah.
So we lose additional fluid from the renal diuresis that is happening due to that increase in our blood pressure. So this is like 3 times double, triple whammy on dehydration, right? So if we increase if our BP goes up, kidneys excrete more urine to regulate. So we have all of these things that can exacerbate fluid loss, and so we have to be mindful, obviously. So let's, I wanted to talk about the hypothalamus, but I'm gonna let you read that. But let's just wrap this up with how much should we actually take in over the course of the day. Did anyone read what the DRI, the dietary recommendation is?
It's like 2.7 for men, and I don't know what the other.
3.7 for men,
Oh, okay.
and then what was it for women?
I don't know.
So the DRI for water is 3.7 liters per day for men and 2.7 liters per day for women. But I want you to keep in mind that this is absolutely a general recommendation, and there are so many other things that play a part in someone's fluid need, right? So if we were to get really really nitpicky about it and individualize it, it should be related to body composition, right? It should be related to level of activity and exercise and sweating, to body surface area. The more body surface area you have, the more fluid you lose. Men have a higher sweat rate and a lower onset of sweat core temperature than females. Men sweat more. Older adults sweat less, but also have a diminished thirst sensation. So everybody's very different. And so how would you personally know if you're getting enough water? What can you monitor with yourself to know if you're actually getting enough water? Your pee, right? So what should your pee look like?
Dark brown.
Right. So monitoring your urine output and color is a big indicator for you. You want it to be clear and you want it to be copious. So clear and copious pee means that you are in euhydration. Does anybody know what skin turgor is?
So you like pinch your skin and it like
Mhm.
stays up.
Yeah. So skin turgor is like the essentially like how quickly your skin will bounce back to its normal whatever place when you pinch it. And so if your skin does what's called tenting, meaning that you pinch it like this and it stays in that pinch, then you are dehydrated. So you can check your skin turgor to see if you're hydrated or not. So monitor your skin turgor. And then the last, and this is very specific to athletes, and we can talk more specifically about this when we get to sports nutrition, but you can measure your body weight. So for every, like say you were to exercise on 5 days a week. Well, each day of the week you can measure body weight before, measure body weight after. You're gonna find a norm for before, then you're gonna see how much weight you actually lost during that exercise session. Because that weight loss is going to be due to fluid loss. So for every 1 pound of body weight loss from exercise, that is equivalent to 16 ounces of water. So you, if you lose, what it says, the recommendations are that if you lose more than 2% of your body weight from an exercise session, you have then put yourself into a compromised situation mentally and physically, and performance will decrease. So staying within a body weight loss of less than 2% of your body weight, you have to calculate that, is gonna keep you as most hydrated as you possibly can and therefore not have performance decrements due to dehydration. But you can also measure it and just know how much water you would need to replenish after you do an exercise session, because 1 pound of loss is equivalent to about 16 ounces of water. All right. That's it. It's 3:16. Let's guys go now.